limitation of the newspaper, television, the internet, or the radio, do not form or express any opinion on any subject connected with this case. Still is finally submitted to you. If you will take them right to the back. It's going to be a quick break, and then we'll come right back.
Once again in session.
Thank you. We're back on the record in State of Nevada versus Simpson and Stewart. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And counsel for Mr. Simpson, Mr. Glanter, you'll be giving your opening now?
I will.
Please, go ahead and
morning,
take the podium.
Thank you. Good morning. This case, as Judge Glass has instructed you, so many times I have lost count, is not about what occurred in California. This case is not about Fred Goldman. This case is about what happened in Las Vegas last year and this time, and whether or not crimes occurred or they did not occur. That is your sole duty as jurors. You have been instructed on that, and you will be instructed on that, I suspect, in the future. This is not a smear campaign against Mr. Simpson, nor should it be. This is not about writing a book and writing a last chapter about Mr. Simpson and Mr. Simpson's life, nor should it be. And Mr. Owens knows that. This is about whether or not the government, Mr. Roger and Mr. Owens, can prove what they've charged my client with. Sandra, the clerk, read this morning, took about 20 minutes, the charges that have been leveled against my client. And then in the government's extremely eloquent opening, there wasn't a single mention of one of them. There was mention about my client's life, about past people in his life, about other legal troubles he's had in his life, but there was very little mention about what happened in Las Vegas, Nevada on September the 13th in 2007. Now, Mr. Owens, during his opening statement, made light of the fact that people like Walter Alexander, Thomas Riccio, Bruce Vermong, and Alfred Beardsley are deal makers. Well, they're more than deal makers, they're hustlers. And from the minute this event was conceived of by Tom Riccio until today and tomorrow and the next day and during this trial, it is about the amount of money that these individuals are trying to make off of the back of O.J. Simpson. It's not about that's how they make their living. They're using this as an event to get their more than 15 minutes of fame. Now, as you sit through this trial, you're going to be able to hear these people, judge these people, evaluate these people, and Judge Glass, at the end of this case, is going to give you some very specific instructions on how to evaluate witnesses and how to judge their credibility. But I'll give you a preview. There are witnesses in this case who have already taken the witness stand in this courthouse and sworn under oath to tell the truth. And during their cross-examination by me of them in front of a judge in this building, they have said that they would sell their testimony, slant the truth for money, and want to get paid. Now, as a defense lawyer, that is disgusting, abhorrent, and violates every premise that every lawyer that has ever walked into a courthouse in America abides by. Because your job, and a lot of the courtrooms I practice in, there's a sign that says, "We who labor here seek the truth and only the truth." And that's what your job is to seek the truth and ferret out the truth. Now, the truth of the matter is that this entire event basically is recorded in one way or another. So there isn't going to be a lot of he said, she said. It's more of, what does it mean? What's the intent? What's behind the words? You know, we all know from watching Perry Mason and Matlock that there are basically two things in any criminal case that has to be shown. One is the whodunit. And on television, people love the whodunit. Well, this isn't about a whodunit, because we know who all the players were. They're on videotape, and they've been recorded. The second thing that occurs in any criminal case is what happened. Well, even the what happened in this case, there isn't all that much dispute about. But the intent of what happened and behind what happened, there is a lot of dispute about. Now, folks, the evidence in this case is going to show that when O.J. Simpson, Charles Cashmore, Mr. McClinton, Mr. Ehrlich, Mr. Alexander went to the Palace Station, that none of them believed, anticipated, intended to commit a crime or break any law in any fashion. Now, the start of that, the way you know that these individuals never intended to break any laws, commit any crimes, violate any laws of the state of Nevada, is that the individual who started this event in motion is Tom Riccio. And he's going to come into court, and I do agree with Mr. Owens, he is a very colorful character. And you're going to get to hear what his motivation was, what he was telling O.J. Simpson, and why he did what he did. And Mr. Owens glossed over it in his opening, but what happened was, when O.J. and Mr. Riccio discovered that stolen personal mementos, items that were taken off of the wall of O.J. Simpson's home in California, were in possession of somebody. I'm going to digress for 1 second. Everybody keeps talking and keeps saying this case is about memorabilia. It's not. Memorabilia is things that are commercially available in commercial channels that you could go on the internet on, go on television on, walk into a sports memorabilia store and buy. That's not what this is about. And you're going to see what was actually taken by my client out of the Palace Station hotel room. And you're going to hear me question Mr. Riccio about it. And what it was pictures that were actually hanging on the wall of his home. These are personal items. These are not items that are covered by any turnover order. They're not considered assets. It's like the clothes on your back. It's like a picture you would have in your wallet. Pictures of his deceased mom. Pictures of his deceased dad. Pictures of him and his children. These were items that had been missing for years and years and years. And you will hear O.J. Simpson on the tapes discuss how emotional he is about it and how he's been trying to recover these personal property items of his for years. Now, what's the start for jurors to determine whether or not there was an intent to commit a robbery or the intent to recover legitimate property that was O.J. Simpson's? Well, the clearest start is when Mr. Riccio calls the FBI. And he says, listen, I know guys that have stolen property of O.J. Simpson's. Please help us recover it. And you know what the FBI does? They slam the door. They say, we're not interested. They're not interested in searching out the truth for Mr. Simpson. They're not interested in helping Mr. Simpson. They don't care. But the question for jurors is, how many people who are going to commit a crime give the FBI a heads up before it occurs? And it's not like this was just a phone call and they talked to some operator. They went and had a meeting, face to face, with agents, and spent time with agents, and begged for help. And the door was slammed. Now, did they stop at that? They did not. Mr. Riccio went to local law enforcement people in California and said to the local law enforcement people in California exactly what he had said to the FBI. This isn't property that's in dispute. This isn't property that's subject to a turnover order. This is property that is Mr. Simpson's personalty. That's what the law calls it. These are pictures that were stolen off of the wall of his home. These are pictures that were stolen from a warehouse that O.J.'s mom had while she was alive. Now you're going to see them. I mean, there's no dispute about that. This isn't commercial assets or commercially viable property. The only person on the planet that cares about this property is this man. Right here. And you could think whatever you want about his past, and you've all agreed as jurors to ignore it. And you could have whatever opinions you want about his life, and you've all agreed to ignore it. But what you're going to see in this courtroom is a case that's not about hiding anything from anybody. This is a case about recovering photographs, personal mementos. You're going to hear one of the witnesses describe how they actually saw the items on the shelf of Mr. Simpson's home. The second time they go to the police say, go pound salt. We're not going to help. Now, through a series of phone calls by Tom Riccio, he arranges that property will end up in a room at the Palace Station. Now, what Mr. Owens said about everybody believing that this room was on the 12th floor of the Palace Station is absolutely correct. O.J. was told that this property was voluminous. And O.J. knew it was voluminous because it was his, and he knew what was missing, and he knew what he had been looking for. So he gathers up these people, and he says to these people, listen, I'm going to need help carrying the stuff. And you're going to hear discussions about, using a bellman. I mean, how many people commit a robbery and use a bellman? Think about that. Think about how many people who come to Vegas don't realize that their photograph, I once read I think your photograph in Vegas is taken like 81 times a minute because there's so many cameras and recorders in this town for security purposes. So that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with knocking on law enforcement door twice. You're talking about going to a place where you know you're going to be recorded, you know you're going to be seen, you know every one of your steps is for the rest of your life emblazoned in some audio or digital tape somewhere. Clearly, these are not the actions of someone who wants to commit a crime. Mr. Owens made mention about this tape at the Palms pool. Well, what is said at the Palms Pool, and you know, you all are going to listen to all the tapes, and what Mr. Owens said about it's not our interpretation of the evidence, it's your interpretation of the evidence that matters. Who is going to commit a crime and discusses it with everybody they see? Now, one of the things you're going to learn real quickly is that O.J. Simpson is not a shy person. As a matter of fact, he'll talk to anybody. He'll talk to strangers. He talks to people he just met. And it's not like there are any secrets in his life. He tells everybody what's going on. And everybody at the pool, and when I say everybody, of course I'm exaggerating a little bit, but whoever he could talk to at the Palms Pool knew that they were going to try to recover some of O.J.'s stolen property. So it wasn't a secret. Now, having been a criminal defense lawyer for 30 years, I can tell you that when most people are about to commit a crime, I agree, Judge. I agree.
All right.
That's not going to be evidence in this case, because I can assure you I'm not going to be a witness. But you're smart people. You watch television. You read newspapers. Not during this case. There aren't too many people who are going to commit a crime and let the whole world know about it.
I object to the argumentative tone of this, although I think it's all been argumentative. I just haven't objected.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Glanter, what's the evidence going to show?
That's what the evidence is going to show. The evidence is going to show that O.J. Simpson, at the Palms Pool, spoke to as many people who would talk to him about the fact that he was finally, at least he thought he was finally going to be able to recover some property that had been taken from his home many, many years prior. You're going to learn, and I'm not going to go through it now, because this case is going to be long, and these witnesses are going to be on the stand for a long time. You're going to hear all these tapes. But you will learn that this idea was conceived of this Tom Riccio fellow. And you're also going to learn that Tom Riccio not only had a motive to make it happen, but had a very strong financial motive. Now, Mr. Owens also made light of the fact that the police didn't get the tape till 5 or 6 days after this event occurred. Well, the reason the police didn't get the tape for 5 or 6 days till after this occurred is because Mr. Riccio wasn't interested in the truth being told or the quest for the truth being known. What Mr. Riccio was most concerned with was selling the tape to TMZ. And it wasn't as if TMZ wrote him a check for $100 for the tape. He sold this tape for north of $100,000. And he kept it from the cops. And he had it for 5 days. And immediately what happened was that tape went out over the airwaves and over the television, and it became a feeding frenzy by the media. Now, this case has a dividing line. And the dividing line is what happened on September the 13th and what happened after September the 13th. Because what occurs is that you hear things on tape, and you don't hear things about guns and robberies and taking stuff that's not mine. What you hear is, I'm going to recover my property. I'm going to recover the stuff that was stolen from me. We're going to go in and we're going to confront these guys, and when we confront them, they're probably going to say, yeah, you're right, the property was stolen. And that actually occurs. They do. You're going to hear conversations between Bruce Frommong and Alfred Beardsley with Mr. Simpson discussing the fact that they knew that the property was stolen from O.J.'s house. That is a fact. You're also going to hear from Mr. Frommong and Mr. Beardsley that immediately, I mean, this event takes 6 minutes. Well, at 6 minutes and 30 seconds, what occurs is that Al Beardsley and Bruce Frommong have a conversation amongst themselves. And thank God Tom Riccio had that recorder in this room that nobody knew about. Because they don't discuss the fact that they've been robbed. They don't discuss the fact that they've been assaulted. They don't discuss anything about calling the police immediately. The first thing that's said by Bruce Vermong is, we have to call Lydia at Inside Edition. I mean, this is like seconds after the event occurs. And you hear Bruce Vermong on the tape talk about he's going to give an interview to Inside Edition, and they're going to have to pay big bucks. They don't talk about talking to the police, a quest for the truth, the fact that they had stolen property and they knew it. Immediately, what they're talking about is, how much money can we make? And they don't care what they have to do to get it. You're going to see firsthand how stories in this case started to change when people realized that media outlets, tabloid magazines were willing to write checks for testimony and interviews. And this isn't, folks, this isn't something that I'm going to have to draw out of these people. I mean, they are freely going to tell you that they were in it for the money. They're still in it for the money. They're still looking to get paid. They're still looking to write books. And they're still trying to sensationalize this in any way they can. Now, there's something added that occurs. And I will tell you up front, and I'm probably not supposed to say this because it is personal, these are very reputable lawyers. And it's a pleasure to try a case with them. But what the state of Nevada did through Mr. Roger and Mr. Owens was they started to cut plea deals with people. Because in order to make a case against my client, they needed to have people say certain things. And what they said after September 13th, after they got their plea deals, and what they said on the tape when nobody knew they were being recorded prior to September 13th, is completely and totally different. And as jurors, you need to go behind that. Because some people say that money's great, but liberty's more important. And what Mr. Owens and Mr. Roger did was they dealt with people's liberty to get people to say things that they needed them to say. And as jurors, you're going to have to determine whether or not the story's changed. And rest assured, we're going to help you do that after September 13th or before September 13th of last year. These tapes will, all of the tapes, and it's not a question of playing snippets or blurbs of the tapes. You know, everything's going to be admitted into evidence. And I would suggest that jurors, you listen to all of it and you make your own determinations, because during an opening statement, pulling out a section isn't fair. It's not. As lawyers, we like to highlight what we think the case is about and what we want you to focus in on. But the truth is that you should look at all of it, do all of it, see all of it. You will learn that the law provides that in order to commit a felony, which is what my client and Mr. Stewart is charged with, that you've got to have, the law calls it mens rea, but it's really felonious intent. And the judge is, in her instructions, she's going to mention the word felonious numerous times. And what that really is that is an intent.
Mr. Lantern,
Excuse me?
going into what the jury instructions?
Judge, I'm done with it.
Well, you were about to explain something that seems to be along the lines of intent, and
Well,
that's for...
intent is what's on trial here, Your Honor.
Well,
And that's the key, and that's what these jurors have to find, and I'm going to remind them of it.
all right, well, remind them, but as far as defining it and all of that,
Listen, the judge is 100% right. This case, as I told you in my opening remarks, is about the intent of the parties. Because there isn't all that much in dispute. And when you go back into that jury room, you're going to have to determine whether the evidence as it's been presented has proven the intent to rob, the intent to steal, the intent to burglarize, or was it the intent to recover someone's stolen property? Because if it was the intent to cover someone's stolen property,
It's argument.
and Mr. Glanter, I'm sorry, but here, you're arguing, so please, save that for the end.
the evidence in this case is not going to show that Mr. Simpson intended to commit a crime. And that's the bottom line. The evidence will show that from day one until today, it has always been about the recovery of stolen items of personality of Mr. Simpson's. Mr. Simpson and Mr. Riccio are communicating after this event. We'll make it a little quieter for you. And a phone call message that you will hear come into evidence in this case pretty much sums up everything I've been saying in my opening remarks, and also sums up what was going through Mr. Simpson's mind and his intent as this event was taking place. Simpson to Riccio. Simpson, hey, blank. Hey man, Tom, it's OJ. Why are they talking about a gun? Ain't nobody have any gun, you know. All I wanted was my stuff back. And they admitted that, Tom, that it was stolen stuff from Mike Gilbert. They knew it was all stolen stuff, so I don't get it. This is, of course, after the media report started to break. And ain't nobody get hit or nothing. I just told the guy, why would you steal my stuff? I thought you guys were my friends, you know, so any of their stuff. I said, I don't want none of your stuff. And you're going to learn when you hear the entire tape that O.J. Simpson keeps saying to the other people who are in the room, don't take anything that's not mine. Clear as day. I said, I don't want your stuff, just give me my stuff. I don't know why they're talking about a gun. Ain't nobody have a gun. Where did that shit come from? Like, I guess they feel like joking, so they're trying to make something up, right? Please call me. This is immediately after the incident, in O.J. Simpson's own words. Folks, over the next few weeks, you're probably going to know everything there is to know about Mr. Simpson's life and what happened here in Las Vegas on September 13th. Keep in mind my opening remarks Mr. Owen's opening remarks. But I submit to you that at the end of this case, you will determine that Mr. Simpson is not guilty of committing any crimes because he never had the intent to commit any crimes. This was a recovery. It wasn't a robbery. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and Mr. Lucarini, you may proceed with your opening as well.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure and the distinction of representing Clarence Stewart. Clarence Stewart is sitting right over there. He just took his glasses off. And he too is on trial today for the charges that you heard Ms. Jeter read. Now, Mr. Owens talked about a book, and looking at this as a book and dividing it up into chapters. And I think that was probably a good approach and helpful for you in setting up how to look at this case. But like a book, every book has a prologue to kind of help you get started, to help you understand what to look for. And I'd ask you to consider a number of things. In this evidence case, the evidence will show that the defendant, Mr. Stewart, never asked anyone for money. The evidence will further show that Mr. Stewart, unlike virtually every one of the other state's witnesses that cut deals, did not record anything. He is not writing a book, hasn't written a book, has no intention of writing a book. And you'll hear testimony of witnesses that were there, that were trying to sell the property, as well as some of the defendants who are now involved in writing or obtaining agents. Mr. Stewart just wants his life back. For the last year, you can imagine what it's been for him. And you'll find out why he hasn't taken a deal, why he's sitting here today. Our best witnesses, you'll find out, are the state's own witnesses. And they will testify as to Mr. Stewart's part, what Mr. Stewart saw, and more importantly, what he didn't see. And the important question remains, what did he see? What did he not see? What did he know? And what did he not know? Now, Mr. Galanter is a very talented attorney. And you heard him describe what O.J. Simpson was trying to do. He was trying to get back his property. Well, imagine if you can, you're Mr. Stewart. And you hear O.J. Simpson, somebody that you respect, describe to you, in the fashion Mr. Galanter described to you, what this property was.
It's sort of, but not quite. So, Mr. Lucarini, continue. Thank you.
But first of all, who is Mr. Stewart? We all know who Mr. Simpson is. We've heard about Mr. Simpson for the last umpteen years, but who is Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart lives in Las Vegas. He has 4 adult children, 32, 26, 25, and 19. One is a minister for the Baptist Church. Another is an engineer. A third one is a stockbroker.
And Mr. Lucarini, is this what the evidence is going to show?
Judge, I'll move on.
Thank you.
You'll find out what kind of work Mr. Stewart did. Mr. Stewart, and the evidence will show, that Mr. Stewart lived in Las Vegas, and he was a mortgage broker. That's a privileged license. He was successful at it, and he was involved in that type of business. And in fact, he was involved in that type of business when this event took place. And in fact, the morning of this particular date, he had met an individual who had flown in from out of state, an individual that is a reputable individual, to look at some property that he wanted him to invest in. The relationship between Mr. Stewart and Mr. Simpson was more of a networking type of relationship. Mr. Simpson was well known, and certain people in the community liked to be with Mr. Simpson. And on occasion, he would use Mr. Simpson to network, play golf. Some of investors would play golf with Mr. Simpson. But Mr. Simpson, and make it crystal clear, Mr. Simpson has never stayed with Mr. Stewart. In addition, every time Mr. Simpson came to town, he didn't always call Mr. Stewart. But when he did call Mr. Stewart, it was usually for help getting tee times at the golf course or reservations at a local restaurant. And that was it. That was the extent of their relationship. They're both competitive golfers. They liked to golf. Mr. Stewart used it to his advantage, and I'm sure Mr. Simpson did the same. But Mr. Simpson had a request, a favor of Mr. Stewart of that particular day to help him go pick up property which belonged to him. Mr. Stewart did not know, and I believe the evidence will show Mr. Stewart did not know this property was stolen. Further, he did not know, and you listen very carefully, he did not know that there were going to be guns brought into this room and used during this incident. Now listen very carefully to the witnesses who testify about guns, who testify about knowledge, and try to understand what their motive is, what their bias is for saying what they have said or are going to say. These witnesses have been offered plea agreements, bargains, given immunity in order for the state to help prosecute and convict O.J. Simpson. That's something that Mr. Stewart couldn't help them with because one, and his story has never changed, one, he didn't know the property was stolen, and two, he didn't know there were guns going to be used in their room. There is no value to his testimony, and the evidence will show that. And that is why he continues to sit where he sits today. Mr. Simpson asked Mr. Stewart for some help picking up this property. Mr. Stewart had also been asked another favor by another individual, Tom Scotto. Tom Scotto was one of O.J. Simpson's best friends. Tom Scotto was here in Las Vegas on that particular day to get married. He and Sabrina Scotto were going to get married. Sabrina, you'll find out, is from Brazil. So along with Tom Scotto and Sabrina Scotto, or soon to be Sabrina Scotto, CJ, Mr. Stewart, took them all over town the afternoon of this incident. Now, Arnell Simpson, Mr. Simpson's daughter, had been asked to be the wedding planner for Mr. Simpson's best friend, Tom Scotto. Unfortunately, she didn't know Las Vegas like you and I do. She doesn't know the difference between West Flamingo and East Flamingo, or West Sahara and Nellis. So you can imagine in her attempt to perhaps save money or in an attempt to get the best deals, she got her location and geography confused. The significance to all that is you have Mr. Scotto, who's driving a rather large SUV, going all over town in the afternoon, beginning around 1:15 and taking up to about 6. They went to West Flamingo for the flowers. and somewhere around East Flamingo or that area for the cake. And back and forth. It was frustrating. It was a hot, and if you can remember, last September, this period of time, it was a rather hot, unusual day. He was hot, he was sick, he had a lot of other things to do, and he was frustrated. But he spent the day fulfilling the promise, keeping his word to do what he said he would do. And he helped him. Now keep in mind, at the same time, he had an investor that had flown in from out of state to meet with him about a mortgage deal that they were trying to set up. In addition, Mr. Simpson had asked Mr. Stewart to help him pick up the property. I suspect he asked Mr. Stewart for help because of his size, his heart, and more importantly, he had a big vehicle. And as Mr. Galanter said, there was an expectation on Mr. Simpson's part that there was going to be a lot of property involved. And so he needed some help picking it up. And he did. But as you listen to the witnesses describe what took place in that room, what took place going to that room, I suggest to you that there will be no credible witnesses that will be able to show that Mr. Stewart had any knowledge about the nature of the property or any knowledge that anybody coming into that room was carrying a gun. Simpson left his party, the Scottos and Arnell, at the Palm Hotel approximately 6 o'clock. Again, he was sick, he was tired, he was frustrated, he was concerned about his other client. And as he left those individuals at the Palms, immediately O.J. Simpson got into his vehicle. O.J. had called him a number of times and said, "Where are you at? What's taking you so long? We need to get going." Just added to the frustration that Mr. Stewart felt. But at the Palms, he met up with Mr. Simpson. And at the same time, Mr. Cashmore was there. Mr. Cashmore worked for Mr. Simpson. Mr. Cashmore wanted to meet Mr. Simpson. Mr. Stewart had sent Mr. Cashmore over there to try to entertain or to quench the problems that Mr. Simpson might have had. That was Mr. Cashmore. On the way over to the Palms Hotel, Cashmore and Simpson made small talk, but there was no talking about whether the property was stolen or if there were guns going to be used. They arrived at the property in Mr. Simpson's SUV. Now, listen to the answers that are given by these.
I have to object, and I hate to do that with fellow defense counsel, but the rendition of events is so far off of what actually occurred that I don't want these jurors to be confused by Mr. Lucarini's statements.
Okay. Well, as I stated before, what the counsel says during openings and closing is not evidence.
Maybe we could remind the jurors of that.
And that'll be borne out throughout the trial, that counsel at this time is attempting to give you a roadmap of what the evidence is going to show. And then, ladies and gentlemen, as the trial proceeds, it'll be up to you to decide whether indeed whatever roadmap you remember or have think about, if in fact the evidence does come out consistent with what's being said here now. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, it's not evidence, and
Could we approach briefly? I know. I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
since we're
sure,
already
why
in break.
not? Let's go ahead and approach, because we haven't approached yet this morning. For the little stretch time we've just had, and if everybody would take a seat, and we'll let Mr. Lucarini resume.
Thank you, Judge. And I agree with the judge. And I hope you understand that the statements that I make are not evidence. It is simply a roadmap. And one problem I do have, Stewart Simpson, I confuse the names. If I do that, I'm sure I'll be corrected. Mr. Stewart was driving the vehicle over to the Palms Hotel. With Mr. Stewart was Mr. Simpson. Okay? When they got to the Palms Hotel, Mr. Stewart parked his SUV in front of the Palms Hotel. In fact, right in the valet area. if he was going to commit a crime or had any intention of committing a crime, he certainly wouldn't have done it so obviously by parking right in the front with an individual that everybody in the country knows. That is Mr. Simpson. And as you probably have already figured out, our defenses and our interpretation of the evidence isn't always going to be consistent with what Mr. Simpson sees. And they have a right to present their case, as do we. And that might be the difficulty that you have in this case, is distinguishing out the evidence that applies to Mr. Simpson and the defenses that applies to Mr. Simpson, as well as that same evidence and interpretation that applies to Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart and Mr. Simpson enter the lobby of the hotel. As they enter the lobby of the hotel, they come into contact with Mr. Alexander and Mr. McClinton. Mr. Stewart did not know Mr. Alexander and Mr. McClinton were going to be there. He was surprised, a little bit shocked, but from his perspective, he wanted to get the day over with. He was tired and sick, and they were individuals that could help carry the property out. And as Mr. Simpson had told him earlier, this shouldn't take more than 10 to 15 minutes. So the addition of Alexander and McClinton wasn't that big of a deal to Mr. Stewart, as he saw what their objection was, what they were going to do that night. They entered into the lobby, and as they were going back, they were met by Mr. Riccio. Mr. Riccio, as you've heard Mr. Galanter say, had set up and brokered a deal between Mr. Fromong and Mr. Beersley and an unknown buyer. Mr. Riccio met him somewhere in the lobby, and as they're being taken by Mr. Riccio to the room that Mr. Riccio had rented, somebody in the group says something to the effect, "Is there going to be a gun?" Riccio immediately said that these two guys in the room are clowns, don't worry about it. And that's the only mention that Mr. Stewart has of the possibility of a gun. Now, when they got to the room, Mr. Riccio used his key to enter into his room. He invited these individuals, Mr. Stewart and the rest of them, into the room. It wasn't a military invasion, it was an invitation because they came in. Mr. Stewart was the first one who came in. Mr. Stewart recognized that there may be a problem with one of the individuals in the room, Mr. Fromong. As you'll hear, even the bellhop, who was a state's witness, recognized that there might be something wrong with Mr. Fromong. His appearance, his demeanor, the way he was acting. So Mr. Stewart immediately went directly to Mr. Fromong and stood in his face, got up close to him so he could see if there was a problem. And he was standing right in front of Mr. Fromong, like I'm standing to the witness chair. Things happening behind him weren't to his concern. He wanted to make sure there wasn't going to be any problem. And he reached over and patted the back of Mr. Fromong's pocket just to make sure there wasn't a gun. In fact, we later find out that Mr. Fromong did indeed have a gun. He did indeed have a CCW, but he had left or forgotten or hadn't brought up that gun to the room. Mr. Fromong probably lost his balance when Mr. Stewart tried to pat him down. Mr. Stewart reached down to help him back up. Again, Mr. Stewart did not see what was going on behind him. And remember, as Mr. Galanter eloquently pointed out, this entire incident took place rather quickly, within 5, 10, 15 minutes. Frohman was surprised. Beardsley was surprised. There was conversation about the property, and you'll hear in that tape a lot of profanity. Some of it is offensive. A lot of it is offensive to a lot of us. But you'll hear Mr. Stewart say words to the effect of, let's get the property and let's get out of here. Because after all, that's what he wanted to do. It was Mr. Simpson's property. Let's get it. Let's go. Let's not cause any more problems. I believe that's the limited statements you're going to hear from Mr. Stewart. If there was a gun in that room, Mr. Stewart didn't see it. Mr. Stewart left the room. Property was bagged up by other individuals, put in pillowcases, and there were some boxes. As Mr. Stewart left the room, outside of the room, there was a box that had been brought out. He picked the box up and he carried it out. Now remember, if your picture is being taken that many times in Las Vegas, and he truly had the intent to commit a crime, then picking up the property, if it was stolen, would have been the dumbest thing he could have done, because his face is going to be on every video camera, in every hallway, in every lobby, and outside. The evidence will suggest to you that he didn't know the nature of the property. In fact, the most aggressive witness in that room, the most demanding witness in that room, the witness that we later found out did bring a gun, was the state's own witness. And you'll hear from Mr. Frohman where that individual was standing. He was standing behind Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart wouldn't have had an opportunity or chance to have seen that gun that was between 10 and 15 feet away from Mr. Frohman. They take the property, they leave the hotel, they're on their way from the Palace Station to the Palms Hotel. When they get to the Palms Hotel, there had been small talk in the vehicle. Mr. Stewart was upset. Again, he was tired. He wanted to get it over with. When they got to the Palms Hotel, Mr. Simpson simply got out of the vehicle and left the property with Mr. Stewart and said, "We'll talk about it later." Period. End of story. Now, as Mr. Stewart was frustrated. He didn't know what to do. He went home. There was a party that night that was going to take place. Rather than go to that party, he went home. He went to bed. He was sick. The next day, there was a party at his house for Mr. Scotto. You'll hear again, his participation was very limited. Again, he was suffering the effects of a sickness. Over the course of the next couple of days, as Mr. Galanter described, the media frenzy got out of control. And he heard about it on the news. Within a matter of a day or two, he contacted an attorney. What should I do? What do I need to do? The attorney met with Mr. Stewart, contacted the police immediately, and arranged for the police to come and pick up the property Mr. Stewart had, all the property. And Mr. Stewart surrendered himself to the police. Those things which we would expect an innocent person to do, he did. Those things that you would expect a guilty person to do, I suggest the evidence will show that he didn't do it. At the very first of our case in chief, in our case, we asked you to promise us during voir dire that if the state bears the burden, who bears the burden of proof, doesn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt their case, that you will find Mr. Stewart not guilty. So, it's not if you find Mr. Stewart not guilty, it's when you find him not guilty. I ask each of you to take notes, to write down what you hear. Ask questions if you feel it appropriate. Listen to the evidence. At the end of the case, I suggest your conclusion will be that Mr. Stewart is innocent and acquitted of these charges. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Mr. Owens, do you have a witness lined up by some chance?
We do, it's lengthy though.
Lengthy. All right, because Sandra has to get the evidence from where we've got the evidence locked up. I'm thinking this would probably be a natural place for us to take a lunchtime break. That means we'll come back and start a little earlier during that time. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to give you your lunchtime recess.